In the turbulent mid-19th century, tales of betrayal and vengeance were as wild as the times themselves. Among the most macabre is the story told under the chilling title The Stable Master's Revenge. According to dramatic retellings circulating in narrative videos today, there came a night in 1864 when four wealthy masters, men of status and power, met a gruesome fate. These four, it is said, were trampled to death by the very horses they once commanded, their final screams echoing through the stables as the animals turned on them in a horrifying reversal of roles. Framed as a combination of revenge and tragic irony, the tale casts the stable master, long overlooked and underestimated by his superiors, as the architect of a terrifying downfall. In this version of events, the horses become instruments of retribution, meting out a punishment no whip, bridle or collar could have foretold. The horse estate stood as a monument to power in 1864, spread across rolling land that seemed deliberately shaped to display wealth rather than serve nature. Long gravel drives cut through manicured fields, their edges lined with white fencing that gleamed even under dull sky. The main house rose at the center like a watchful lord, built of stone hauled from distant quarries, its windows tall and narrow, its balconies decorated with ironwork imported at 8 cost. Every visitor understood immediately that this was not merely a place of business but a declaration, a statement that money here was abundant enough to command land, animals and people alike. Behind the house stretched the true heart of the estate, the stable. They were massive, far larger than necessary, built not just to shelter horses but to impress anyone who stepped inside. Oak beams blackened with age arched high above the stalls, and brass nameplates were fixed beside each door, engraved with the names of prized animals and the bloodlines they represented. The air was thick with hay, leather and iron, layered with the sharp scent of polish from bridles and saddles that were cleaned daily, whether they had been used or not. Lanterns hung in perfect rows, casting warm light along the aisles, ensuring that even at night the stables never truly slept. The horses themselves were worth more than entire villages. Bred for speed, strength and obedience, they came from renowned lines, their ancestry discussed with the seriousness of noble family. Some were towering draft horses with muscles like carved stone, others sleek riding horses with coats so glossy they reflected faces back at those who stared too long. Each animal had a specific purpose and a specific value, and that value was constantly measured, debated, and boasted. Buyers traveled days to inspect them, to run gloved hands along powerful necks, to test hooves against packed earth, to imagine how ownership of such a creature might elevate their own standing. Money flowed through the estate like a quiet river. Contracts were signed in rooms warmed by fireplaces even in mild weather. Ledgers were filled with careful handwriting, recording sales, breeding fees and wagers placed on races and demonstrations. Servants moved silently through corridors carrying trays of food and drink, listening without being acknowledged. New buildings appeared almost as soon as someone mentioned a need for them. A larger hay barn, a covered training ring, a guest house for visiting investors. Nothing here felt temporary, and nothing felt beyond reach. The masters of the estate took pride in their control. They walked the grounds as if each blade of grass existed by their permission. Their boots were polished, their coats tailored, their voices sharp and certain. They spoke of horses as assets, of land as leverage, of people as tools. When they gathered in the stables, their laughter echoed against the beams, loud and careless, mixing with the restless shifting of hooves. They enjoyed demonstrating authority, issuing commands simply to watch how quickly others obeyed, measuring respect not by loyalty but by fear. The estate employed dozens of workers, each with a defined role and little room to step beyond it. Grooms rose before dawn to feed and clean, their hands cracked and raw from constant labor. Blacksmiths worked near the edge of the property, the ring of hammer on iron, a constant reminder of the estate's reach. Trainers drilled horses in precise routines, pushing them until muscles trembled, stopping only when ordered to do so. Overseers watched closely, correcting mistakes with harsh words or harsher consequences, ensuring that efficiency never gave way to compassion. Every surface reflected discipline. Tools were arranged exactly, stalls swept until no trace of dirt remained, harnesses hung at identical heights. Mistakes were noted and remembered. A crooked latch, a horse left restless too long, a moment of hesitation in response to a command could all bring punishment. The masters believed this strictness was necessary, that dominance over animals required dominance over people, and that any sign of softness would spread like rot. Outside the estate's boundaries, the world of 1864 was restless and fractured, shaped by war, loss and uncertainty, but within the fences there was an illusion of permanence. The masters spoke as if their wealth placed them above chaos, as if horses and land could insulate them from the shifting tides beyond their field. They hosted lavish gatherings where wine flowed freely and deals were struck with handshakes, where guests admired the estate as proof that some men were destined to rise no matter how dark the times became. At dusk, when shadows stretched long across the paddocks, the estate took on a different character. The horses grew more alert, ears flicking at distant sounds, hooves striking the ground with quiet impatience. Lanterns were lit, casting moving shapes along the walls, and the air cooled just enough to carry whispers from one end of the stables to the other. Workers moved faster then, eager to finish tasks before night fully settled, knowing that mistakes made in the dark were judged more harshly than those made in daylight. The masters often lingered after dinner, strolling through the stables with drinks in hand, discussing profits and plans while horses shifted in their stalls. They enjoyed this hour, believing it demonstrated ultimate control, men in fine coats walking calmly among animals that could crush them with a single kick. They trusted in routine, in hierarchy, in the belief that everything within those walls existed to serve their will. The estate at its felt untouchable, a machine of wealth and power running smoothly, every part locked into place, every sound familiar, every shadow accounted for, every gate closed just enough, every presence noted, every absence ignored. The four masters were bound together not by friendship but by appetite, each feeding off the authority the estate granted them. They differed in age and temperament, yet cruelty served as their common language, a dialect spoken fluently in raised voices, sudden blows and rules designed to humiliate rather than instruct. To outsiders they appeared respectable men of business, their names spoken with admiration in distant towns, but within the fences of the estate, their reputations were forged through fear. The eldest among them had inherited his power rather than earned. His hair was already thinning, his posture stiff, yet his presence carried weight because generations before him had owned land, horses and people. He believed discipline was a tradition, something passed down like property, and he practiced it with cold detachment. When he punished, his face showed no anger, only mild inconvenience, as if correcting a flaw in a tool. He remembered every slight, real or imagined, and he waited patiently to repay it, convinced that authority meant never having to forgive. Another master was loud, restless and volatile, a man who enjoyed cruelty because it reassured him of his position. He shouted often, even when silence would have served, and he laughed while doing so. His boots were rarely clean, his hands always busy, striking a railing, slapping a whip against his leg, reaching out to shove a worker aside simply because he could. He took pleasure in watching others flinch, reading fear as loyalty, and when challenged even slightly, his temper burned hot and fast, leaving bruises and broken confidence in its wake. The third was careful and calculating, a man who believed suffering should be efficient. He spoke softly, almost kindly, but his words carried sharp edges. He preferred punishment that lingered, that reminded a person of their place long after the moment had passed. Reduced rations, impossible workloads, public correction delivered with polite smiles. These were his tools. He understood that visible violence could attract attention, while quiet cruelty became part of the routine, absorbed into the rhythm of daily labor, until no one questioned it. The youngest of the four wore refinement like armor. He dressed impeccably, spoke with practiced charm, and enjoyed presenting himself as more enlightened than the others. Yet his cruelty was no less severe, only more selective. He targeted weakness with precision, choosing moments when resistance was impossible and witnesses were scarce. He delighted in forcing obedience through debt, threats of dismissal, or whispered promises that were never kept. He believed himself clever for avoiding open brutality, convinced that manipulation proved superiority more than force ever could. Together, they ruled the estate, through overlapping methods of control. A worker might escape the wrath of one only to fall under the scrutiny of another. Complaints vanished into silence, swallowed by the knowledge that every path led back to one of the four. They cultivated rivalry among the staff, rewarding informants with small privileges, punishing solidarity as rebellion. No one was allowed to feel secure for long, because insecurity kept hands moving faster and mouths closed tight. Their treatment of the horses mirrored their treatment of people. Animals were pushed beyond limits, trained through exhaustion and fear, rather than trust. Whips cracked not as correction, but as reminder. A horse that resisted was labeled dangerous, a liability, and punished until it submitted or broke. Injuries were ignored if the animal could still stand, pain dismissed as inconvenient. The masters spoke proudly of discipline, of breaking spirit as necessary work, never acknowledging the trembling flanks, the wide, fearful eyes, the scars hidden beneath glossy coats. Each master justified his actions differently. One spoke of tradition, another of efficiency, another of order, another of progress. Together they formed a closed system of belief, reinforcing one another whenever doubt threatened to surface. When a worker collapsed from exhaustion, they blamed weakness. When a horse reared in terror, they blamed poor training. Responsibility never traveled upward, only down, settling on those least able to carry it. They dined together often, recounting the day's events with casual amusement. Stories of punishment were told as anecdotes, accompanied by laughter and wine. A groom's mistake became entertainment, A trainer's injury became a lesson. They spoke openly in front of servants, confident that silence equaled acceptance, mistaking restraint for agreement. The power imbalance pleased them, reinforcing the idea that fear was not only useful, but deserved. Occasionally an outsider would comment on the harshness of the estate's methods, a visiting buyer or investor noting tension among the staff, or restlessness among the horses. The masters dismissed such remarks with practiced ease, explaining that excellence required sacrifice, that lesser men simply did not understand the demands of greatness. Their confidence discouraged further questions, and visitors left impressed by wealth, blinded to the cost paid by those who maintained it. Over time the cruelty grew normalized, woven into routine so tightly that it became invisible to those who practiced it. Orders were obeyed automatically, punishments anticipated before they were delivered. Fear became background noise, constant and numbing. The masters mistook this quiet for loyalty, this submission for respect, never considering the difference. They believed control was absolute because resistance was not immediate, failing to recognize the patience born of desperation. Each master carried his own private arrogance, the belief that consequences were meant for others. They trusted fences, schedules, routines, and titles to protect them. They walked the estate unguarded, assuming obedience had erased danger. Their cruelty had convinced them of their own invulnerability, a belief strengthened by years without challenge. The idea that those beneath them might harbor something more than fear never crossed their minds, because acknowledging it would have required seeing workers and animals as something other than possessions. Their power rested on repetition. The same paths walked daily, the same commands shouted, the same punishments delivered. Habit dulled caution. They stopped noticing the looks exchanged behind lowered heads, the tension that lingered too long in the stables, the way horses stiffened at familiar footsteps. They assumed the world within the estate was fixed, unchanging, locked into the hierarchy they enforced, never imagining that cruelty, repeated long enough, could become something else entirely, something patient, something waiting. The stable master was a man few noticed unless something went wrong. He moved through the estate with the quiet confidence of someone who knew every board, every latch, every temperament housed within the stables. His clothing was plain, worn but clean, his boots scuffed from years of walking the same stone paths before dawn and long after dusk. To the masters he was part of the structure, as unremarkable as the beams overhead, present only to ensure that horses were fed, stalls were clean, and routines never faltered. He had come to the estate years earlier, younger then, with broader shoulders and fewer lines etched into his face. He learned quickly, not because he was taught kindly, but because mistakes were punished and memory became survival. He learned which horses startled easily, which responded to voice rather than whip, which would endure pain and silence until they collapsed. He learned which overseers to avoid, which moods to anticipate, which hours of the day were safest to speak, and which demanded silence. Knowledge accumulated slowly, layer upon layer, until the stables felt less like a workplace, and more like an extension of his own body. The masters rarely addressed him by name. When they did, it was sharp, impatient, a summons rather than acknowledgement. He answered without hesitation, eyes lowered, voice steady. He understood the value of appearing unthreatening. Silence protected him. Obedience kept him employed. Yet behind that controlled exterior, his attention never rested. He watched everything, not out of curiosity but necessity. Watching meant predicting, and predicting meant avoiding the worst of what the estate could deliver. He spent more time with the horses than anyone else. Before sunrise he moved among them, checking hooves, adjusting tack, murmuring sounds meant to soothe rather than command. The animals recognized him in ways they did not recognize others. Some leaned subtly toward him, others relaxed their stance when he approached. He never mistook this for affection, only understanding. He knew fear well enough to recognize its absence. He saw how horses reacted differently to hands that struck versus hands that guided, and he filed these observations away without comment. Punishment was not foreign to him. He had endured it personally, absorbed it without protest because protest only invited more. A missed latch, a restless horse, a perceived delay could bring swift consequences. He learned to accept blame even when it was undeserved, because blame ended quicker than argument. Over time he learned to appear smaller than he was, to take up less space, to blend into the background until his presence felt expected and harmless. Despite this, responsibility gathered around him. Tasks others avoided found their way to his hands. When a horse refused to eat, he was called. When an animal grew dangerous, he was ordered to manage it. When a visiting buyer demanded perfection, it was his work that ensured it. The masters trusted results more than people, and his results were reliable. That trust did not come with respect, only expectation, a silent demand that he continue to absorb the burden without complaint.
He listened carefully when the masters spoke among themselves, especially when they assumed he was not paying attention. Conversations carried through the stables at night, voices loosened by drink and arrogance. He learned which horses were considered expendable, which men were disliked, which rules bent easily, and which did. He learned schedules, absences, patterns of movement, that repeated so often they became predictable. Information gathered quietly, stored without visible reaction. There were moments when anger surfaced, sharp and sudden, but he forced it down. Anger was dangerous. It revealed itself in posture, in breath, in the tightening of hands. He replaced it with patience, with routine, with the steady rhythm of labor. Years passed this way, each one reinforcing the idea that survival depended on endurance. Yet endurance did not erase memory. Every insult, every blow, every humiliation remained intact, catalogued with the same precision he used to track feed and training schedules. The horses became mirrors of his own condition. He recognized the look in their eyes when they were cornered, the tension before impact, the stillness that followed submission. He adjusted his movements to ease them, even when he knew his efforts would be undone by others later. These small acts of mitigation were all he allowed himself, quiet interventions that reduced suffering without drawing attention. He understood the estate's rhythms better than anyone. He knew when gates were locked out of habit rather than necessity, when guards were absent, when exhaustion dulled awareness. He knew how sound traveled through the stables at night, which boards creaked, which shadows concealed movement. None of this knowledge was dangerous on its own. Combined, it formed a map of possibility. To the masters he remained the silent stable master, dependable and invisible. They mistook his calm for emptiness, his restraint for acceptance. They never questioned why the horses responded to him differently, why problems resolved when he intervened, why disorder seemed to recede in his presence. They accepted the benefits without examining the cost. Inside him, something hardened over time, not rage, not hatred, but clarity. He saw the estate as it truly was, stripped of its wealth and ceremony, reduced to relationships of power and fear. He understood that control depended on cooperation, and cooperation could be withdrawn as easily as it was given. This understanding did not announce itself. It settled quietly, like dust in the corners of the stables, accumulating unnoticed, waiting for the moment when observation would no longer be enough, and silence would finally serve a different purpose.
The horses were not taught so much as subdued. Their training built on intimidation rather than understanding. From the moment they arrived at the estate, they were introduced to a system that valued obedience above all else. Enforced through pain, exhaustion, and repetition, young horses were separated quickly from anything familiar, placed into stalls where the walls seemed to close in, where strange smells and unfamiliar sounds kept them alert and unsettled. Fear was considered useful, a tool to keep them responsive, and so it was cultivated deliberately. Training sessions began early and lasted long past the point of fatigue. Whips cracked sharply in the air, not always to strike but to remind. Loud voices echoed through the enclosed spaces, sudden and unpredictable, ensuring that the horses never relaxed fully. Any hesitation was met with pressure. Any resistance answered with force. The idea was simple and brutal: break the will early so it would never rise later. Those who trained them believed that a frightened animal was easier to control, mistaking tension for discipline. The horses learned quickly that discomfort followed confusion. When commands were unclear, punishment arrived anyway. They were expected to respond instantly, even when instructions contradicted previous lessons. Over time, this inconsistency eroded trust, replacing it with hypervigilance. Muscles remained taut even at rest, ears flicking constantly, eyes wide and alert. Sleep came in shallow intervals, broken by every unfamiliar sound. The estate interpreted this alertness as readiness, never considering the cost. Physical signs of stress became common. Backs stiffened, joints swelled, breathing grew uneven after sessions that pushed bodies beyond endurance. Injuries were treated only when they threatened usefulness. A limp was ignored until it slowed performance. Raw skin beneath harnesses was covered rather than healed. Pain was normalized, folded into the daily routine as something inevitable and acceptable. The horses learned that showing distress brought no relief, only more attention, more force. Handlers varied in temperament, but the system shaped them all. Some took no pleasure in cruelty but followed orders without question. Others embraced harshness, finding satisfaction in dominance. A few attempted gentler methods quietly, only to be reprimanded for softness. Kindness was seen as weakness, a risk to efficiency. Over time, even those inclined toward care learned to harden themselves, to detach from the animals as individuals and see them as units of labor. The horses responded in predictable ways. Some became aggressive, lashing out unexpectedly, their fear transforming into violence. These were labeled dangerous, Their behavior blamed on flawed temperament rather than circumstance. Others retreated inward, complying mechanically, eyes dull, movements automatic. They followed commands without resistance, but without presence. Their spirits flat. This obedience was praised as success, cited as evidence that the methods worked. Training through fear required constant reinforcement. A horse allowed to relax too much was considered a problem waiting to happen. As a result, calm was never permitted to settle. Even in moments of stillness, a sudden noise or sharp command would shatter any sense of safety. The unpredictability was intentional. The masters believed that uncertainty kept animals responsive, that a horse unsure of what came next would remain attentive. The stable master saw the consequences daily. He recognized the signs others ignored, the subtle tremor in a leg, the flinch at raised hands, the way certain horses refused eye contact. He noticed how different they were with him, how tension eased slightly when his voice replaced shouting, when his hands moved steadily instead of striking. These small changes confirmed what he already knew, that fear created compliance but destroyed balance, leaving animals unstable beneath the surface. Some horses remembered earlier lives, traces of gentler handling that lingered like ghosts. They reacted strongly to certain gestures, certain tones, memories triggered unexpectedly. Others had known nothing else, and responded with a blank obedience that unsettled anyone who looked closely. The estate did not look closely. Results mattered more than well-being. A horse that ran fast, pulled hard, or carried weight without collapsing was considered successful, regardless of what it endured to reach that point. Failures were removed quickly. A horse that refused commands too often, that injured a master or cost money, was disposed of without ceremony. These disappearances served as warnings, reinforcing fear among the remaining animals. Loss was immediate and unexplained, another layer of uncertainty woven into daily existence. The horses learned not only to fear pain but absence, the sudden removal of familiar presences, the instability of their world. The training environment itself amplified fear. Enclosed spaces magnified sounds, turning footsteps into threat. Shadows shifted unpredictably as lanterns moved, creating shapes that startled already tense animals. Night sessions were particularly harsh, exploiting darkness to heighten disorientation. The horses learned to obey even when senses failed them, relying on instinct shaped by punishment rather than understanding. Over time, this system created a fragile illusion of control. On the surface, horses responded sharply, movements precise, power contained. Beneath that surface, pressure built steadily. Fear does not dissipate when ignored. It accumulates. Muscles remembered every strike, every shout, every moment of helplessness. Instincts dulled in some areas and sharpened dangerously in others. The animals became unpredictable, not because they lacked training but because fear had trained them too well. The masters took pride in demonstrations of dominance. They showed visitors how easily a horse could be driven, how quickly it responded to command. Applause followed these displays, reinforcing belief in the system. No one questioned why a horse's sides heaved long after exertion ended, why eyes rolled white at sudden movements, why hooves struck the ground with excessive force. These details were dismissed as temperament, as the cost of power harnessed. The stable master understood that fear was not loyalty and obedience was not trust. He saw how close the line was between control and chaos, how little it would take for balance to Horses trained through fear did not forget it. They carried it with them, stored deep in muscle and memory, waiting for a moment when confusion or panic would override conditioning. In such moments, the very strength cultivated through harsh training could turn against those who relied on the power that had been forced into submission, finding sudden violent release. Humiliation settled into the stable master's life so gradually that at first it felt like weather, something endured rather than challenged. It began with small things, the tone of voice used when addressing him, the way orders were given sharply even when there was no urgency. He was corrected publicly for errors that were not his, spoken to as if his understanding were always in question. Laughter followed these moments sometimes, not loud, but enough to make clear that dignity was not something he was meant to possess. Over time, these moments multiplied. Instructions were deliberately vague, then criticized for being followed incorrectly. Praise was withheld even when work was flawless, while blame was assigned freely. The masters found efficiency in this imbalance. Keeping him uncertain ensured compliance. He learned to accept rebukes with lowered eyes, to nod even when words cut deep, because resistance only prolonged the experience. Silence became armor, thin but necessary. Physical labor was paired with symbolic degradation. Tasks beneath his role were assigned suddenly, not because they were needed, but to remind him of position. He was ordered to scrub floors already clean, to repeat work that had been inspected moments earlier. These commands were issued in front of others, ensuring the lesson spread beyond him. The message was clear. Authority could reshape reality at will, and his time,
Effort and pride were expendable. There were days when exhaustion blurred everything, muscles ached constantly, hands cracked and bled, sleep came in fragments. On such days insults landed harder, slipping past defenses built through routine. A careless word, a mocking smile, a deliberate mispronunciation of his name could unravel hours of restraint. He felt anger rise then, sharp and dangerous, but he swallowed it, knowing the cost of letting it surface. Anger belonged to those with power. For him it was a liability. The humiliation extended beyond words. His presence was ignored when convenient, then demanded instantly when needed. He could stand unnoticed for long stretches, only to be summoned abruptly and blamed for delay. Meals were interrupted, rest periods cut short, personal boundaries dismissed entirely. He was reminded repeatedly that nothing in his life was his own, not even his attention. The masters often spoke about him as if he were not there. Decisions affecting his work were discussed openly, criticisms delivered in the third person. This erasure was more damaging than direct insult. It suggested not just inferiority but invisibility. Being seen as less than human required less justification for cruelty. He absorbed this lesson deeply, learning how easily people accepted it. Occasionally, a master would feign generosity, offering a small favor or kind word after a particularly harsh episode. These moments were confusing by design. They disrupted resentment, replacing it with cautious gratitude. The stable master learned to distrust them, recognizing the pattern. Kindness that followed cruelty was not mercy but control, a way to reinforce dependence while avoiding accountability. He was blamed for the actions of others, punished for accidents caused by faulty equipment or unrealistic demands. If a horse was injured, suspicion fell on him first. If schedules failed, responsibility found its way to his shoulders. Defending himself only worsened the situation. Explanation was interpreted as excuse. He learned to accept fault reflexively, because acceptance ended the exchange faster. Years passed under this weight. The humiliation did not break him outwardly. He continued to work with precision, to anticipate needs, to keep the stables functioning smoothly. This consistency protected him, but it also deepened the injustice. His competence became another tool used against. Because he endured so much without visible resistance, expectations grew heavier, demands more unreasonable. The other workers noticed, though they rarely spoke of it. Some pitied him quietly, others distanced themselves, afraid association would draw attention. He understood their silence, and did not resent it. Survival required separation. He carried his burden alone, knowing that shared resentment was easily punished, but private endurance went unnoticed. Humiliation reshaped his inner world. He stopped imagining alternative futures, stopped expecting fairness. Instead he focused on observation. Each slight was remembered not emotionally, but factually. He noted who delivered it, under what circumstances, how often. Patterns emerged. He learned which masters enjoyed public embarrassment, which preferred quiet degradation. This knowledge did not ease the pain, but it organized it, turning suffering into information. The repetition numbed him in some ways, sharpened him in others. Insults that once burned now registered as confirmation rather than surprise. The predictability stripped them of power. Even as they continued, he no longer reacted internally to every slight. Instead he stored them, not as grievances, but as evidence of how the system functioned. There were moments alone, late at night in the stables when the weight pressed hardest. The quiet made space for thoughts he suppressed during the day. He remembered earlier versions of himself, before humiliation became routine, before silence replaced speech. These memories did not inspire hope so much as clarity. He saw how systematically dignity had been removed, how deliberately dependence had been created. The humiliation was not accidental or personal, it was structural, maintained through repetition and reinforcement. Recognizing this shifted something inside him. Suffering lost its randomness. It became intentional, designed. Understanding that did not ease the burden, but it changed how he carried it. The pain no longer asked what, it asked how long, and under what conditions, and what it revealed about those who inflicted it. Every insult, every public correction, every reminder of his place added another layer to a quiet resolve. Not the resolve to confront openly, or rebel impulsively, but to endure with purpose. Humiliation taught him patience more effectively than kindness ever could. It trained him to wait, to observe without reacting, to measure power not by volume but by leverage. The masters believed humiliation kept him small. They believed repeated degradation erased selfhood. They did not notice the way his responses grew more controlled, the way his eyes lingered longer on details others ignored, the way he absorbed everything without visible response. They mistook endurance for emptiness, failing to see how years of humiliation refined his awareness, sharpened his understanding of fear, authority and the fragile mechanisms that held their world together. The night was not chosen in haste or anger, but with the same care the stable master applied to every other responsibility placed upon him. It emerged slowly from observation, shaped by patterns repeated so often they felt permanent. He noticed how certain evenings unfolded predictably, how the masters lingered longer after meals on specific days, how guards grew lax when wine flowed freely, how routine softened under the assumption that nothing ever changed. These nights stood out, not because they were chaotic, but because they were comfortably familiar. He began to measure time differently, not by hours but by movements. The moment lanterns were lit, the moment the last guest departed, the moment voices shifted from business to amusement. He learned how long it took for footsteps to fade from the main house to the stables, how laughter echoed before dissolving into quiet. He noticed when doors were left unsecured out of habit, when gates were closed loosely rather than checked. Small deviations, insignificant on their own, formed a map when viewed together. There were nights when the masters stayed away entirely, and those were discarded immediately. Absence removed opportunity. The night needed their presence, their confidence, their expectation of safety. It needed them relaxed, predictable, unguarded by suspicion. It also needed silence elsewhere. Too many workers nearby would complicate things. Too few would draw attention. Balance mattered. Weather became part of the calculation. Clear nights carried sound too easily. Storms brought unpredictability that could not be controlled. He favored nights heavy with still air, when clouds pressed low in muffled noise, when darkness felt complete even with lanterns lit. Such nights encouraged calm in those who trusted routine and unease in those already burdened by fear. He understood how horses responded to weather as well, how certain conditions heightened tension, while others dulled awareness. He tested assumptions quietly. A latch left slightly ajar one evening to see if anyone noticed. A gate closed later than usual to observe reaction. Each test was minor, easily corrected if questioned, yet informative. He watched how long it took for errors to be discovered, who noticed them, who ignored them. The results confirmed what he suspected. Vigilance had eroded, familiarity had replaced caution. The chosen night had to align with all of this. It needed to be ordinary enough to avoid scrutiny, yet specific enough to offer advantage. He marked it mentally weeks in advance, long before it arrived, adjusting his own behavior to appear even more routine than usual. He arrived earlier, worked steadily, avoided unnecessary interaction. Nothing about his presence hinted at deviation. The masters themselves unknowingly reinforced the choice. Their habits were consistent. They favored certain evenings for inspecting horses after dinner, using the stables as a place to display authority, and indulge in idle commentary. On these nights they moved together, confident and unhurried, drinks in hand, boots echoing against. They trusted the environment completely, believing fear had already done the work of protection. He considered the staff carefully. Which workers would be exhausted enough to retreat early, which would be stationed too far to hear disturbance, which would assume any unusual sound was part of normal stable unrest. He ensured schedules aligned naturally, without direct intervention. Fatigue and routine did the rest. People tend not to question what fits expectation, especially at the end of long days. The horses were central to the timing. He knew which animals would be stabled where, which were most sensitive to disturbance, which responded violently to panic. He adjusted feeding times subtly, nothing noticeable, enough to influence restlessness without drawing attention. He understood how small changes could ripple outward, how tension could be encouraged without direct cause. That night also needed distance from oversight, records, inspections, visitors. All of these could create complication. He ensured the chosen evening followed a period of heightened activity. When attention was already spent, after busy days, complacency followed naturally. People assumed nothing significant would happen precisely because something significant had just passed. Emotion did not guide the decision. Memory did. Each humiliation, each punishment, each reminder of powerlessness contributed not urgency but clarity. He did not seek spectacle, he sought inevitability. The night had to feel like the natural outcome of everything that came before, even if no one recognized it as such until afterward. As the date approached, he felt no excitement, no fear, only focus. He continued his duties with the same precision as always, his demeanor unchanged. Those who interacted with him saw nothing unusual. The masters, accustomed to his silence, noticed nothing at all. They mistook consistency for loyalty, routine for surrender. On the day itself, nothing distinguished it from any other. Work progressed normally, orders were given and obeyed, punishments were delivered for minor infractions, laughter followed one. The estate settled into its familiar evening rhythm. The absence of warning was the final confirmation that the night was right. As darkness fell, The conditions aligned almost effortlessly, air heavy, sounds muted, routines intact. The stable master moved through his tasks with practiced ease, making small adjustments that blended seamlessly into normal operations. Each movement had purpose, but none appeared deliberate. Every choice was hidden within habit. The night belonged to the estate as it always had. That familiarity was its weakness. Those who believed themselves safest were the least alert. Those who assumed control was permanent, failed to recognize how fragile it had become. The stable master understood that timing was not about speed or secrecy alone, but about expectation. The right moment was one in which no one imagined a moment could exist at all. When the final preparations were complete, nothing outward marked the difference between this night and countless others before it. Lanterns burned steadily, horses shifted in their stall. The masters approached with their usual confidence. The estate held its breath without realizing it was doing so, suspended in a stillness created not by chance, but by patience, observation, and the careful selection of a night that asked for nothing more than for everyone to behave exactly as they always had.
The gates were never meant to be dramatic. They were heavy, practical things designed to control movement quietly, their hinges oiled just enough to prevent noise that might spook valuable animals. Most nights they remained exactly as they were set at dusk, closed and secured out of habit rather than fear. That habit was what made them dangerous. When routine replaces attention, even solid iron becomes vulnerable. The stable master understood this better than anyone. He knew which gates were checked carefully and which were trusted blindly. He knew which bolts were stiff, and which slid easily with a familiar touch. Over years he had been the one to open and close them, to report faults, to ensure order. That trust worked in his favor. No one questioned a gate he had passed through. No one rechecked what he had already handled. As night settled fully, the stables grew restless in their usual way. Horses shifted their weight, stamped occasionally, snorted at distant sounds. Normally these movements blended into a predictable rhythm, a low background noise that workers learned to ignore. Tonight that rhythm was nudged slightly off balance. A latch not fully seated. A barrier left unfastened just enough to fail under pressure. Each adjustment was subtle, indistinguishable from ordinary wear. Panic does not arrive all at once. It builds. A sudden movement in one stall drew attention. Another horse reacted instinctively, responding not to threat but to energy. Hooves struck wood harder than usual. The sound traveled quickly through enclosed space, echoing and amplifying, turning minor disturbance into perceived danger. Horses trained through fear responded as they had been conditioned to do, with heightened force and confusion. The gates failed at the precise moment tension peaked, not thrown open violently, but yielding under pressure they were never meant to withstand. Wood cracked, iron scraped against stone. The sound was unmistakable, sharp enough to cut through conversation, loud enough to trigger alarm. Horses surged forward, not with intent but instinct, bodies colliding as space collapsed around them. Darkness intensified everything. Lantern light wavered wildly as movement disrupted air and balance. Shadows stretched and distorted, confusing already panicked animals. The smell of sweat and fear thickened rapidly. Hooves struck ground faster, harder, no longer guided by reins or voice. Training dissolved under the weight of terror, replaced by raw momentum. The stable aisles became narrow channels of chaos. Horses burst free of stalls, some slipping, others scrambling to regain footing. Each fall increased panic, each collision multiplying force. The sound was overwhelming. A thunder trapped indoors, reverberating off beams and walls. Any attempt to impose order vanished instantly, swallowed by noise and movement. Those who rushed toward the disturbance were met not by control but by mass. Horses do not stop easily when fear drives them forward. They do not distinguish between obstacle and threat. Bodies became barriers. Iron shoes struck stone, wood, flesh. The confined space magnified every misstep, every shove, every desperate turn. The stable master did not need to guide the chaos. He understood it too well to interfere. Once fear took hold, it required no direction. The horses responded to one another, feeding off shared panic, reacting faster than thought. Gates designed to separate now funneled movement, channeling force into specific paths. The architecture of control inverted itself. Shouts were lost beneath the noise. Commands that once demanded instant obedience carried no meaning now. Horses reared, bolted, stumbled, driven by the same fear that had been cultivated for years. Training designed to suppress will had removed the very mechanisms that might have calmed them. There was no trust to fall back on, no familiar reassurance to anchor them. The ground grew slick with churned dirt and spilled water. Straw scattered violently under pounding hooves. Lanterns fell, glass shattering. flames flickering dangerously close to dry hay before being snuffed out by motion. Darkness deepened, broken only by brief flashes of light and the white of rolling eyes. Those caught among the horses had no space to retreat. Walls closed in, exits blocked by surging bodies. Fear transferred instantly. What had once been dominance dissolved into helplessness. The same confined corridors that had made supervision efficient now became traps, offering no escape, no shelter. The horses did not act with malice. They acted with memory. Every strike they had endured, every shout, every moment of restraint surfaced in their movements. Fear sharpened strength, turned discipline into violence without intention. Each animal responded individually, yet the effect was collective. A storm formed from countless conditioned reactions colliding at once. The sound of impact was relentless. Wood splintered. Iron rang sharply. Breath came in harsh bursts, both animal and human, indistinguishable in the dark. Panic erased hierarchy. Titles meant nothing here. Authority could not command momentum. The estate's order collapsed into pure motion. Outside the stables, the night remained eerily calm. Clouds muffled sound, absorbing echoes that might have carried far. From a distance, nothing seemed amiss. Inside, the chaos consumed itself, feeding on fear, until exhaustion and injury slowed it. Horses circled blindly, crashing into walls, into each other, into anything that moved or stood still. The gates that had once symbolized control now lay twisted or broken, their purpose reversed. Instead of containing animals, they had released force. Instead of protecting people, they had exposed them. The stable, once a place of rigid order, became a space where power no longer functioned as intended. As movement gradually lost coherence, pockets of violence persisted unpredictably. A startled horse lunged suddenly, another slipped and struggled violently to rise. Each motion carried risk, each second extended danger. There was no clear beginning or end, only a cascade of reactions set in motion by small deliberate failures. The stable master remained apart from the center of chaos, close enough to understand its flow, far enough to remain untouched. He did not rush, he did not shout. His stillness contrasted sharply with the frenzy around him. He had known how this would unfold, not in detail but in principle. Fear, once unleashed, obeyed no one. The night swallowed the noise gradually as exhaustion set in, as bodies slowed, as space filled with the aftermath of uncontrolled movement. What remained was disarray impossible to explain as accident alone, yet rooted so deeply in routine that blame would scatter in every direction. Gates that should have held, horses that should have obeyed, systems that should have protected, all undone not by force but by the careful removal of restraint at precisely the wrong moment. The masters entered the stables as they always had, with confidence shaped by years of unquestioned control. Their boots echoed against stone, familiar and authoritative, the sound that usually brought instant stillness. They expected horses to shift aside, heads to lower, space to open for them without thought. That expectation lingered only for a moment, before the noise around them changed, deepened, fractured into something sharper and more chaotic than they recognized. At first confusion slowed them. A sudden surge of movement disrupted the orderly lines of stall. Horses pressed forward unexpectedly, bodies colliding, eyes wide and rolling white in the lantern light. One master laughed nervously, mistaking it for momentary restlessness, raising his voice to assert command. The sound of his shout vanished beneath the thunder of hooves striking stone and wood. Too loud, too close, too fast. Panic spread unevenly. Then all at once, a horse burst from a stall with explosive force, slamming into another, setting off a chain reaction that rippled down the aisle. The masters stepped back instinctively, their confidence faltering as space disappeared around them. The narrowness of the stables, once a symbol of control, now compressed movement, forcing bodies together, leaving no room to maneuver. One master stumbled as the ground shifted beneath his feet, straw and dirt churned slick by frantic motion. He reached for a beam, a wall, anything solid, but the impact of a passing horse knocked him sideways. He hit the ground hard, breath driven from his chest, soundless beneath the roar. Before he could rise, hooves struck close enough to feel, then closer still, iron shoes flashing past his face, inches from his skull. Another tried to run, pushing toward what he believed was an exit, only to find it blocked by a surge of animals driven blindly forward. Horses do not see men in panic, they see obstacles. He raised his arms, shouting commands that once carried weight, but now meant nothing. A powerful shoulder struck him squarely, spinning him into a wall. Pain exploded through his ribs as he slid downward, trapped between stone and muscle. The third master attempted to assert control through violence, lifting a whip instinctively, striking at anything within reach. The gesture only heightened the chaos. The crack of leather against flesh triggered immediate response. A violent recoil from a horse already on the edge. The animal reared, hooves coming down wildly. Not aimed, not controlled, driven by terror rather than intent. The master fell backward, his cry cut short as weight crashed down upon him. Sound became distorted. Fragment screams tore through the thunder of hooves, raw and unrestrained. The voices of men who had never expected fear to answer them back. Pain registered too quickly to process. Bones fractured under force they could not resist. Breath failed under crushing weight. Each second stretched unbearably as the stables continued to convulse around them. The fourth master stood frozen longer than the others, shock locking his body as reality overtook assumption. He had believed himself untouchable, protected by habit and hierarchy. He watched as horses surged past him, felt the ground vibrate beneath their combined mass. When one slammed into him, he fell hard, his head striking stone, vision exploding into white sparks. He tried to rise, hands slipping uselessly on the churned floor. Horses moved without pattern now, circling, colliding, slipping, driven by the contagious nature of fear. Each fall intensified panic, each scream fed it. The confined space ensured no escape. The masters were no longer individuals of authority, but bodies in the way, indistinguishable from any other obstacle. Iron shoes struck flesh with sickening force, weight pressed down relentlessly, chest, legs, spine pinned beneath hundreds of pounds moving without awareness. The smell changed quickly, sweat, fear, blood mixed thickly in the air, metallic and suffocating. Breathing became impossible for those trapped beneath fallen horses, or against walls. Attempts to cry out dissolved into hoarse gasps. The sound of bones breaking was lost beneath the noise, yet felt sharply by those beneath the impact. Pain blooming faster than thought. Time fractured, moments blurred together, stretched endlessly or vanished altogether. The masters experienced terror without structure, each second indistinguishable from the next. Training, authority, wealth meant nothing here. There was no negotiation with panic. No command that could halt momentum once unleashed. One master lost consciousness early, his body still absorbing impact without response. Another remained aware longer, trapped on his side watching hooves rise and fall dangerously close to his face, unable to move, unable to shield himself. The knowledge that the horses belonged to him, that he had ordered their treatment, that he had believed them obedient beyond question, cut through the fear with bitter clarity. The horses did not stop, they could not. Panic allowed no pause, no reflection. Each animal responded only to the immediate press of bodies, the threat of being crushed itself. Survival drove movement, not intent. The tragedy unfolded without villain or hero in the moment, only momentum created by years of conditioning erupting uncontrollably. Gradually, strength failed, bodies slowed. Some horses collapsed from exhaustion or injury, blocking movement, causing others to stumble and fall. The violence did not end cleanly. It sputtered, surged, retreated, returned. Each resurgence delivered new blows, new crushing weight. Those trapped beneath could not tell when it would stop, only that it had not yet. When silence began to creep back in, it arrived unevenly, broken by labored breathing, by the scrape of hooves on stone, by low panicked snort. The masters lay where they had fallen, bodies twisted unnaturally, limbs at angles that made movement impossible. Pain lingered where consciousness remained, overwhelming and absolute. The stable that had once echoed with confident voices now held only the aftermath of uncontrolled force. Lantern light flickered weakly over motionless forms, over blood-darkened straw, over walls marked by impact. The horses stood trembling or lay heaving, eyes wide, sides streaked with foam and dirt, their fear spent, but not forgotten. No command followed, no rescue arrived in time. The estate's hierarchy had collapsed into silence, its authority reduced to stillness beneath hooves that no longer recognized masters. Only the lingering echo of terror that had finally been given space to move on broke slowly over the estate, painting the world in pale, washed-out light that did little to soften the horror inside the stables. The morning carried a quiet so profound it seemed unnatural, a stillness that had not existed for hours. The chaos of the night was no longer visible in movement, but in the devastation it left behind, a landscape of blood-stained straw, splintered wood and bodies that would never rise again. Every corner, every stall bore marks of violence, traces of a power reversed, a force long suppressed now unleashed with lethal precision. The first light illuminated what had been unthinkable. The four masters lay where they had fallen, twisted unnaturally beneath the mass of their own command. Their faces pale and contorted, told of terror no wealth or status could shield them from. Muscles locked in positions of struggle, hands still clawed at air that could not be moved, eyes staring wide and unseen. Death had come quickly for some, lingering for others. Yet in all cases it had been absolute.
leaving nothing of dominance or authority intact. The stable master had predicted the inevitability, yet even he could not ignore the full magnitude of what he had orchestrated. The horses moved slowly now, wary, exhausted, and unsure of what had transpired. Some remained lying in stalls, trembling from exertion, their breathing heavy and irregular. Others wandered cautiously, sensing the absence of familiar patterns, the sudden removal of the hierarchy that had guided every step for years. Their coats were matted with sweat and blood, hooves caked in mud churned by frantic movement, eyes wide and constantly flicking as if expecting the nightmare to continue. No words could calm them, no gestures could explain the sudden reversal of roles that had placed those who once dominated them beneath their sheer physical force. The stable itself bore the physical scars of that night. Gates lay twisted on their hinges, latches torn from frames, wood splintered under the combined weight of panic-driven force. Lanterns had been knocked over, some extinguished entirely, others casting flickering light that accentuated the chaos frozen in space. Tools and equipment were scattered indiscriminately, saddles and bridles tossed aside, hay strewn across floors that had once been meticulously clean. The smell of iron, sweat and fear lingered heavily, a tangible reminder of the violence that had unfolded within these walls. Silence dominated, yet it was not comforting. Every small sound, hooves shifting, straw crunching under careful steps, a distant crow seemed amplified, echoing against the high beams and walls, reminding any observer of the intensity of what had occurred. The stable master moved among the aftermath with a deliberate calm, his presence steady amid chaos, noting details invisible to anyone else. The angles of collapse, the way bodies had fallen, the subtle signs of panic etched into the horses' stances, all of it confirmed the precision of his understanding, the inevitability of what had been set into motion. Workers who arrived later could scarcely comprehend this. Some froze in shock, unable to process what had happened, while others turned away quickly, unwilling to look at what they assumed could not be survived. Whispers passed along the periphery of the estate, tentative and disbelieving. Questions were asked quietly, hushed, half-formed. No one dared speak too loudly. No one dared assume authority over the aftermath, for the system they had relied upon had been undone so thoroughly that any attempt at explanation felt futile. The Four Masters' demise was a lesson encoded in every detail. The smallest lapse, the unfastened gate, the familiar habits exploited with patient observation, had all conspired to remove power from the men who had assumed themselves untouchable. Fear, trained into the horses over years, had become a weapon without intent, a force that could not be controlled once released. The stable master, patient and unnoticed for so long, had created conditions for inevitability, yet the reality of witnessing the result was still staggering in its absolute finality. No ceremony, no announcement, no witness could adequately capture the horror and the precision. Those who had relied upon hierarchy realized its fragility in an instant. Authority is not permanent when it depends solely on fear. Once the instrument of fear reverses, the consequences are total. The horses, once subjugated, now dominated, moved instinctively through space that had previously been claimed as human territory. Walls, gates and stalls, symbols of control, had become tools in the expression of instinctual power. The stable master observed every detail. He did not rush, did not intervene, for the moment was already complete. Every movement of the horses, every angle of a fallen beam, every fragment of splintered wood told a story he had anticipated but now studied fully. He catalogued not only the success of the night's plan but also the subtle ways in which chaos had been contained and channeled. Even in devastation, order emerged in fragments, revealing the natural tendencies of those trained to respond to fear, and the inevitable consequences of suppressed force. Animals that had been silent witnesses during the night now displayed subtle signs of recognition. They reacted cautiously to human presence, movements slow and measured, eyes flicking nervously to corners and doorways. Some remained near the fallen masters, standing over them instinctively, while others avoided them entirely, reflecting the disruption of their normal routine. Even in the aftermath, the psychological imprint of the night lingered on the horses, just as it would on anyone who might later enter the stables and witness the consequences. Time seemed to stretch as the first rays of sun illuminated the devastation. Light revealed more than could be absorbed immediately. The spread of chaos, the impact of force, the fragility of human assumption in the face of cumulative conditions long cultivated. The stable master's patience and observation had converted preparation into inevitability, yet the starkness of reality could not be diminished by planning. The aftermath demanded contemplation, a recognition of the fragility of power when it depends on unquestioned compliance, and the suppression of natural instinct. The estate itself felt changed. The main house, the driveways, the fences, everything beyond the stables remained outwardly the same, but the center of authority had been shattered. Whispers of what occurred would spread, distorted and half-formed, carrying lessons that could be interpreted differently depending on perspective. The stable master, unobserved, understood the permanence of these lessons, knowing that control was a temporary illusion that could be dismantled with patience, timing and an understanding of the forces around him. Each object in the stable became a reminder: splintered wood, broken tools, overturned lanterns, blood-stained straw. Every element reinforced the inevitability of what had transpired. The chaos was physical, immediate, and undeniable, leaving no space for denial. The horses themselves, though exhausted, continued to move cautiously, carrying the imprint of the night into every interaction, every response to touch or command. Their instincts, sharpened through fear, now operated unchecked by prior authority. The silence was punctuated only by small, involuntary reminders of movement: a shifting hoof, a low snort, the scrape of a body adjusting. For the first time, the stable master could move freely through the space he had long observed but never fully controlled. He was surrounded not by authority as he had known it, but by its complete absence, the result of patient orchestration and the reversal of power that had once seemed permanent.
The aftermath settled slowly, a heavy weight pressing over the stables in a silence that felt almost unnatural after the chaos of the night. Every corner of the space bore the mark of upheaval: splintered wood where horses had collided with stalls, iron fittings twisted under impossible pressure, straw churned into clumps, slick with sweat and blood. The air was thick with odor, a mixture of sweat, fear and the sharp ring of iron, lingering in every breath and reminding anyone who entered that the previous night had been absolute and unrelenting. Light, faint and pale, filtered through windows and lanterns, illuminating the devastation and making every detail starkly visible. The four masters lay where the momentum of the night had deposited them, bodies unmoving, faces pale and contorted by fear and trauma, muscles stiff from struggle and impact. Some had died instantly, the force of the horse's panic ending life before thought or sensation could register fully. Others had suffered longer, consciousness lingering as the weight of bodies and hooves crushed them slowly, until inevitability had claimed each one without hesitation. Authority, once absolute, had been stripped entirely, leaving only the fragile remnants of human pride scattered across the stable floors. The horses moved cautiously now, their energy spent but instincts alert, eyes darting constantly as if expecting the chaos to return at any moment. Their coats were damp with sweat, streaked with mud and the marks of frantic collisions. Some remained close to the fallen, their instincts unable to relinquish the sense of urgency that had driven them the night before. Others avoided the bodies, pacing slowly along aisles, their hooves soft against straw, movements deliberate and calculated as if testing the space for safety. The animals had absorbed the panic of the night, and though the immediate violence had passed, the residue of fear lingered in their postures, their movements and the tension in their muscle. The stable master walked among the aftermath with a calm that belied the enormity of what had transpired. Every detail was catalogued with precision: the direction of impact, the position of each horse, the angle at which a gate had twisted under pressure, the distribution of broken tools and debris. He observed how animals reacted to fallen obstacles, how they recalibrated instinctively after chaos, and how the patterns of fear and movement could be traced in the aftermath. Nothing was left to chance. He had orchestrated inevitability through patient observation, careful timing, and intimate knowledge of both human and equine behavior. The success of the night was absolute, yet the stable master's attention remained analytical rather than celebratory. Workers arriving later were struck silent by the scale of devastation. Some could not bring themselves to look directly at the bodies of the masters, turning away in shock or covering their eyes. Others whispered softly, disbelieving and fearful of acknowledging what had happened, uncertain how to process a scene where authority had been obliterated so completely. Their hesitation and silence reflected a broader truth. The system they had trusted had collapsed, and with it, the assumptions that had governed behavior for years. Control, when maintained solely through fear and habit, had proven fragile beyond measure. The estate beyond the stables remained outwardly unchanged, but the center of power had shifted irrevocably. Where the masters had assumed permanence, their absence created a void that could not be ignored. Whispers would spread through the estate, stories amplified and distorted with each retelling, reinforcing lessons of fragility, unpredictability and the hidden consequences of cruelty. The stable master, invisible to most and long underestimated, now understood fully the permanence of what had occurred, the complete reversal of roles that had shifted the balance of power in a single inevitable night. Every object in the stable became a testament to the events: shattered wood, bent iron, overturned lanterns, matted straw. These were not merely debris, they were evidence, reminders of what happens when force, habit and fear are mismanaged, when authority fails to recognize the limits of control. Even inanimate objects carried the story of the night forward, each broken hinge and splintered post a message to anyone who might observe the aftermath that human dominance is fragile, contingent, and vulnerable. The horses, despite their exhaustion, continued to move with heightened caution. Subtle adjustments in posture and stance reflected memories of sudden panic, a conditioned awareness that life could shift violently without warning. Some remained close to the fallen, instinctively protective or uncertain, while others maintained distance, wary of further disturbance. Their behavior illustrated the complexity of instinct shaped by fear and repeated exposure to threat. They had survived, but survival left traces, responses that could not be erased by time alone. The stable master moved among them without fear, knowing that his careful observation and preparation had shielded him. He catalogued reactions, measured responses, and assessed the new equilibrium forming in the stable. The chaos had removed the oppressive presence of the masters, yet the environment was not entirely safe. Horses still carried tension, debris posed hazard. He adjusted and corrected quietly, blending care with distance, guiding the aftermath without interfering overtly, ensuring survival without drawing attention. Time stretched in the quiet aftermath. The estate had never felt so empty, so devoid of its usual hierarchy and authority. The absence of the masters created a vacuum, both literal and psychological, that affected everyone who observed or entered the stables. The normal rhythms of work, once dictated by their presence and orders, now required adaptation. Workers who had once relied on fear-driven obedience were forced to confront the fragility of routine, the ease with which authority could collapse, and the unpredictable consequences of cumulative neglect and cruelty. The stable master understood the long-term implication. Knowledge, patience, and observation had created a moment of absolute inevitability, a reversal that would not be forgotten. He had seen patterns in daily life, exploited habits and weaknesses, and allowed the natural consequences of fear to manifest fully. What had been built through years of cruelty, arrogance and assumption had unraveled in a single night, leaving behind not chaos alone but clarity. Authority maintained through fear is temporary, and even the most carefully structured system can fail when its foundations are ignored or underestimated. The estate itself seemed to hold its breath, aware perhaps in a subtle, almost imperceptible way that the stables had changed fundamentally. Where once certainty had existed, there was now doubt, a recognition that control is fragile, that momentum can overturn even entrenched hierarchy. The stable master, moving through the aftermath, understood the lessons implicit in every splintered post, every horse's wary movement, every shadow cast by broken light. He saw how absolute authority, when exercised without understanding or respect, could be undone in a single inevitable sequence of events. The weight of what had transpired extended beyond immediate physical damage. The psychological impact would ripple through the estate for years. Workers would remember the night, carry its lessons silently in every glance, every cautious step, every whispered conversation. Horses would adjust behavior permanently, reacting not just to immediate stimuli but to the memory of a night when instinct overtook dominant. Authority, once assumed inviolable, had been tested and found fragile. Even as the sun rose fully, casting light on the wreckage, the stable master remained calm, patient and observant. He moved deliberately, cataloging every detail, noting patterns for future understanding, ensuring that what had occurred would inform not only the present moment, but the understanding of cause, effect, and inevitability. The night had ended, but its lessons persisted, inscribed in space, in bodies, in memory, and in the subtle movements of the creatures that survived. The aftermath was complete, yet it demanded continued attention. Cleanup, care, and observation would follow, but the immediate reversal of power had achieved its purpose. The four masters who had believed themselves untouchable had been undone by the very forces they had cultivated and ignored. The stable master, patient, meticulous, and deliberate, had executed a plan rooted in observation, timing, and understanding of both human and animal behavior. The consequences were absolute, irreversible, and a testament to the fragility of unchecked authority, the inevitability of natural force, and the power of calculated patience. The estate would never be the same. The memory of that night lingered like a shadow over every corridor, every stall, every beaten path. The masters had once walked with pride. The four who had wielded control now existed only as cautionary evidence, their arrogance replaced by silence and finality. The stable master, once overlooked, now held the invisible authority that came not from title but from understanding, patience, and the mastery of forces others had underestimated. Power, he had proven, was never granted. It was earned through observation, timing, and the ability to act when the moment was inevitable. The horses, once instruments of submission, now carried the legacy of that reversal in their every movement, their eyes reflecting a memory of chaos that no human command could erase. The stables, scarred and silent,
stood as a monument to the consequences of cruelty, arrogance, and disregard. And the stable master, quiet, unassuming, precise, remained, a figure who had harnessed knowledge and patience to reclaim balance, proving that even the most rigid hierarchies can crumble when respect is absent, fear is mismanaged, and inevitability is allowed to take its course. From that day forward, every footstep in the estate carried awareness. Every glance at the stables reminded all who entered that power is fragile, and that true mastery lies not in dominance, but in understanding, preparation, and the patient orchestration of forces that once unleashed cannot be ignored. The stable master had turned years of suffering, humiliation, and observation into one absolute, irreversible lesson, that the forces we underestimate often hold the power to reshape destiny, and that patience, knowledge, and timing can make the silent observer the ultimate arbiter of fate. The echoes of that night would persist forever, a warning and a testament. Arrogance invites its own undoing, cruelty ensures consequences, and even the mightiest fall when the balance of fear and force is misjudged. And in the shadows of the stables, the stable master remained, calm, watchful, and unassailable, the quiet architect of justice that history would never forget.